Hello, I'm Ted Gamble, Chair of the British Architectural Library Trust. The Trust is the nonprofit entity that supports the library and collections of the Royal Institute of British Architects. This is the second presentation in the Trust's inaugural lecture series, 4 programs focusing on the extraordinary work and continuing influence of the 16th century Italian architect Andrea Palladio. The series will be followed by future web-based presentations examining the work of other specific architects, as well as a range of topics relating to architecture and design. Today's lecture, entitled Palladianism in Britain and Ireland, will explore Palladio's influence on the architecture of the British Isles from the 17th century to today. The next 2 lectures in the series will consider his impact on American architecture, and finally his continuing relevance to architecture going forward. The series is presented in conjunction with the RIBA's Palladio project, a comprehensive reassessment of Palladio's drawings being undertaken in association with the Chiesa Palladio in Vicenza. The project will provide unparalleled access to Palladio's work for a new generation of scholars, students, architects, and the public. This lecture will be presented by the noted architectural historian and author, Dr. Stephen Brindle, who has been associated with English heritage for over 30 years. Dr. Brindle will be introduced by Dr. Gordon Higgins, an architectural historian who specializes in architectural drawings and design practice in early modern England. Dr. Higgott will also serve as interlocutor for the program. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Gordon Higgins.
Thank you very much, Ted. Thank you very much. A great pleasure to be here. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce Stephen Brindle, a long-time colleague and friend who we both joined English Heritage together in 1989. Since then, Stephen has been a historian and an ancient monuments inspector, now senior historian at English Heritage, and throughout his long and distinguished career there, he's worked on many major buildings, researching the Windsor Castle after the fire in 1992, Dover Castle, Westminster Abbey, producing monographs in the process, including a major study of Paddington Station, a monograph on Isambard Kingdom Brunel, and several studies relating to Palladianism, including articles or contributions to the great catalogue on William Kent designing Georgian Britain, where he wrote on Kent the painter and Kent in Italy, and then another study of Pembroke House. Stephen's range is immense, and he's now taken on the very challenging task of writing a new architecture in Britain and Ireland, 1530 to 1830, to succeed Sir John Summerson's great work in that area. And Stephen is now nearing the final stages of writing that work for publication. Today, he's going to take us on a very wide-ranging journey through the history of Palladianism in Britain and Ireland, looking afresh at this topic and placing it in a very broad context. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Stephen and hear his talk, and we'll be having a discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Gordon, thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction. And Wayne, I believe you're going to share your screen, and I'm going to say, next slide, please, at hopefully fairly frequent intervals. And there we go. Thank you very much indeed. Gordon, thank you for that very warm and kind introduction. And could we have the next slide, please? Well, why Palladio? After all, there were a good many eminent Italian architects in the 16th century, but there is little doubt that Palladio has had a wider influence. One wouldn't necessarily say he was the most important in the development of Renaissance architecture, absolutely in Italy, but certainly outside Italy, Palladio has almost certainly had a wider influence, and his name was more often mentioned as a creator, influencer, and maker than any other architect. So why him? After all, in a way, he's comparatively late on the scene, and also he is in relative terms a provincial a northerner? Well, I think we have to start with Palladio's own background as a stonemason and the fact that he crossed social and professional boundaries in becoming a professional architect, and he did so by the favour of some remarkable Italian aristocrats, educated humanists, in particular Gian Giorgio Trissino and Daniele Barbaro. And he cut his teeth in Renaissance architecture, so to speak, actually building the loggia of Trissino's villa, which you see on the left, in the early 1530s. And 20 years later, he designed the famous Villa Barbaro at Massa for Daniele Barbaro. So Palladio, educated as stonemason, profoundly versed in the practicalities of building and the realities of mason's yard, became educated in the theory and archaeology of ancient classical architecture by the patronage of highly educated aristocrats. And in his own life and in his work, he spanned the practical, the real and the ideal to a remarkable degree. And his great book does the same. And I think this is the starting point for an answer. And the next, please. And Palladio himself, of course, was not a pioneer. He was stepping into a tradition which was already mature in Italy and mature enough to be becoming sophisticated and complex and contradictory approaches to using the classical language were already being developed. And in works in particular like Giulio Romano's own house in Mantua on the right, and in the wonderful palace that Nardo Bramante designed for Raphael in Rome on the left. And Palladio saw both these things, and they were both important influences on his work. So he's stepping into a mature tradition. He is not a pioneer in this sense, whatever else he is. And the next, please. The category of Palladio's works which were most influential of all in England, without a doubt, of his built works, that is, were his villas. For there were certain social analogies between the situation of the Venetian noblemen who bought estates on the terra firma and who had large villa residences there. Palladio was using what was a well-established villa, well-established built form, a comfortable gentleman's residence with a large farm at the center of the estate, but he elevated it to new heights architecturally. Previously, Renaissance architecture in Italy had for the most part been about urban building types in urban contexts, and Palladio developed in a highly original way this approach to designing villas which were at once highly practical, centers for villa estates. They were practical, they were economic to build, but they embodied perfect classical proportions in their plan and in their elevations and section, and they embodied a rigorous approach to the use of the classical language of architecture and its application in domestic buildings like these. They have, of course, almost nothing to do with ancient Roman villas, which didn't really look like this at all, but that really wasn't the point. The Villa Imo is a case in point. It has a temple front portico, which, as we know, private residences in the ancient world almost certainly did not do. They were far too much associated with temples, with the homes of the gods. But for Palladio and his contemporaries, it seemed reasonable to think that a great man's residence was adorned with a portico, and so porticos he applied. And in this respect, he was pioneering in his own time. And it's one of his more original contributions to classical architecture, the use of temple front porticos on private houses. And these were probably the most influential of all his works in England, in the English-speaking world. And the next slide, please. But within Italy, the villas were not necessarily the most prominent buildings, being deep in the country. The ones that were seen by more contemporaries probably would have been the town palaces, like these two in Vicenza. Almost all of them were and are in Vicenza, so not actually seen by that large a cross-section of Italian society, which is why Palladio's books become so important, because Vicenza itself was not really on the traveller's route of major Italian cities to visit. But at any rate, Palladio's urban palaces there are very different in shape to the villas. The villas could have perfect symmetrical forms because they were freestanding, built on open sites. The palaces were on narrow streets, usually on quite constrained sites in an urban context. And so they weren't freestanding. The plans quite often are irregular because the plots were in irregular shape, but Palladio gave them magnificent architectural treatments. And the kind of treatment he gave something like the Palazzo Valmer on the right, you might compare to the drawing of a flank of a Roman temple. You might compare it to a drawing that has been expressed as a facade with a giant order. And I think we'll talk a little more about that later. And the next, please. But the reason that Palladio was so influential beyond Italy, beyond the Veneto, is above all to do with his books, and above all the Quattro Libri dell'Architettura, published in 1570. Now, here again, it's not as if Palladio was in any way unique. A good many books were published in Italy in the 16th and 17th centuries, published about architecture, a good many illustrated books. But for certain reasons, the Quattro Libri has been head and shoulders above the rest in terms of the breadth of its influence. Alberti's book was the first and was pioneering. Various editions of Vitruvius were immensely important and used by everyone because Vitruvius was the ancient authority. Then Serlio's great book, produced in 7 parts and eventually published as a single work, was the most widely influential book in Northern Europe, of the Italian books in Northern Europe in the 16th century. And certainly in Elizabethan England, the most important printed sources for Elizabethan masons wanting to use classical ornament, classical motifs, were Serlio and probably the books by Jan Vredeman de Vries. And I don't think most of them had probably never heard of Palladio. So why was Palladio's book so much more influential than the others? Well, Alberti's was not published in his lifetime, was in Latin and was not initially illustrated at all. Vitruvius's manuscript was not initially illustrated, though Palladio himself produced illustrations for his friend and patron Barbaro's edition of Vitruvius, 1556 and 1567. Serlio, far more widely disseminated than those others, but Serlio's woodcuts of the orders are relatively crude. He set out the rules nice and clearly, but he elided the complexity of the ancient sources, and that's probably putting it rather mildly. And although Serlio presented a great variety of drawings, both of ancient buildings and designs of his own, they are a little crude in their representation. They're certainly crude in representation of details and exact proportions. And the next slide, please. And when we come to Palladio's book and Vignola's, they are at an altogether higher level in terms of the archaeological thoroughness with which they'd been investigated and in terms of the quality of their presentation. So you're looking at Serlio's presentation of the Doric order on the left and Vignola's on the right. And Palladio and Vignola, who are both looking in a very rigorous way at ancient buildings, realized quite quickly that the ancient sources were actually very complex. There were lots of different variants of things, and they were trying to work out what the correct forms for things were. And there are fine differences of detail between Palladio and Vignola, and they realized there were actually differences of detail between lots of the ancient buildings, and this became a major issue in the culture of classical architecture. Now, Vignola's Cinque Ordini is actually the most translated, most published book in all architectural history, and it became generally accepted in the continent as the source for the orders. But the orders is all it contains. Palladio's book is so much wider and so much more broader in its content. And it's for that reason really, that Palladio, that we talk about Palladian or Palladian rather than Vignolan architecture. And the next, please. Because Palladio gave you things like this. He gave images of ancient buildings, like looking at the Temple of Mars Ultor in Rome on the left, reconstructed by Palladio from actually very battered and fragmentary remains, and he presented very precise information. The image on the left, Temple of Mars Ultor, has dimensions in feet. He's telling us that there is a spacing of 7 foot and 2.5 inches between the columns. But on the right, in this theoretical image of the Corinthian order, he's telling us that the standard spacing for Corinthian columns is 2 modules, the module being the diameter of a column near its base, 2 modules apart. So his book gives us both ancient exemplars with specific dimensions in feet, and it gives us theoretical images in which the proportions are explained in a modular approach, the module being the diameter of the column, which is fundamental to a particular building, in this case, the Corinthian order. And the next, please. So Palladio provides a whole suite of images of ancient buildings, which represent inspiration, which present an idealized vision of the ancient past. And he also presents designs of his own, like this one, I think it's Villa Pisani, for examples of how classical architecture can be applied using suites of perfect harmonic proportions to solve contemporary needs and problems. He gives you rules on how to design the orders. He shows you what the actual dimensions and size of ancient buildings are. He gives you modular rules for proportioning both the orders in detail and for buildings at the large scale. And the next, please. So Palladio's book was the widest in its scope, the most clearly laid out, the most inspiring for generations of cultivated people inside Italy and out, and in particular in the English-speaking world, because it does things which none of the other books did, and it covers a wider range than any of the other books, and it sets out the issues more clearly. And because Palladio himself knew how to put buildings together, it is written with an eye to the practicalities of buildings too. The Quattro Libri is a great masterpiece. Now, I'm going to talk very briefly here about the what was happening in architecture in England, because I just want very briefly to challenge the idea that classical architecture arrived in a sort of top-down way, that the English didn't really know what they were doing, and then copies of Palladio appeared and they struck their foreheads and thought, oh, so that's how you do it. And it was all brought about by his influence. I would argue that there was a slow vernacular change in the character of building in England and in the British Isles, which arose from all sorts of factors in society and economics. And it's in factors like the decline of timber framing and the rise of brick construction, the rise of thin-walled brick construction, a move from buildings like Broome Park, which is on the left, which is planned in ranges which are 1 room deep, to buildings like the Dutch House at Kew, which is a compact house, 2 rooms deep, compact, or in this case, a double pile house. Chimneys moving from outer facades to inner spine walls, proportions of windows changing from being broad in proportion with mullions and transoms to having upright proportions. And the next, please, Wayne. And to gables declining and houses having hipped roofs instead, which it's much easier to do if you're building a double pile, a compact building, which has depth of plan. And timber framed houses in town morphing by degrees into brick fronted terrace houses, like these ones of about 1658 in Newington Green, which, as you see, have Doric pilasters. And the next slide, please. All of these changes in lighting and heating and approaches to planning, and the banishment of servants to basements, and a desire for more privacy and more private space in houses, and houses being built with double pile plans, and gables being abandoned as elements in external facades, and chimneys migrating to interior walls, can all be explained in terms of social and economic and technical and even climatic factors at home. But they were reacting with classical influences from a great range of sources, which were as likely at the time to be printed sources from France and the Netherlands by cultural osmosis in England, in which these changes in the culture of architecture were interacting with classical influences. These would have happened even if Palladio had never been born. But what they did mean was that English architecture was becoming amenable to being designed according to classical principles. And if it hadn't moved in this direction, Palladio's influence could not have been manifested in any case. And the next slide, please. So Palladio doesn't represent the fons et origo of this shift towards classical principles of design. That, I think, has much deeper and more complex causes, a lot of which are social and economic and technical. But Palladio represented an idealized way of conceiving buildings using the classical rules, which in the mid-17th century, very few people in England still knew about. So a house like Coleshill here in Berkshire both represents all of these social changes and technical changes. It's a compact house with a spine wall and chimneys on the inside walls, and with this new approach to planning, but it's built with an understanding, with a realization that in Italy, the culture of classical architecture had to do with the application of a suite of proportions, of rules of design, and of ancient exemplars in relation to the ornament. So if the vernacular of architecture was shifting of its own accord, Palladio represented an idealized, perfected statement of classical design. Could I have the next slide, please? And the next, please. And the first person to grasp this in England in any systematic way was Inigo Jones, a man who was originally a painter, and then effectively a mask designer, an interior designer, and who educated himself in the principles of Italian architecture. In the course of a couple of journeys to Italy, he acquired a copy of Palladio's Quattro Libri around 1601, and he started annotating it a little later in about 1608. And this is a page from his annotated copy of Palladio's 4 books, in which he's comparing the details to what he actually saw when he went to visit the Temple of Minerva to Assisi himself. And the next, please. Now, before long, Palladio managed to acquire a large collection of drawings. Jones managed to acquire a large collection of drawings by Palladio through the agency of a cultivated Englishman called Sir Henry Wotton, who probably bought them in Vicenza from Palladio's son, Silla Palladio. And Jones probably acquired more while in Italy in 1613-14 in the company of Lord Arundel, and they were a unique resource for him and later for his assistant and nephew John Webb. And the point of choosing these 2 images is they're things which don't appear in the Quattro Libri. On the left, we have an orthogonal view of the Palazzo Valmarana, which shows the street facade to the left and the courtyard treatment to the right. The courtyard treatment wasn't actually executed and the plate wasn't engraved for the Quattro Libri. And on the right, we have the plan of the Villa Valmarana, and that too is something which doesn't appear in the Quattro Libri. So Jones had all sorts of things which weren't available to anyone else. And the next, please. So Jones had been to Italy. He'd seen buildings by Palladio and Scamozzi. He had met the elderly Vincenzo Scamozzi. He had this great collection of classical drawings, and he understood that classical architecture wasn't simply a suite of decorative elements to be applied to a building whose design had originated in other factors. It was supposed to start with perfect proportions, with harmonic proportions, with analogies to musical harmony, and it was supposed to be designed according to rules, although the rules themselves were complex and could be varied. It's certainly not true to say that Palladio was the only significant influence on him. There are other influences, notably that of Scamozzi. So if you look at the sources for, say, the Banqueting House of Whitehall, and that's the design on the left, well, there are designs by Palladio with superimposed orders, and there's even one, the Palazzo Barberano in Vicenza, which has the Corinthian order over the Ionic order, but in the Banqueting House, what we actually have is the composite order over the Ionic order, and there is no source in Palladio exactly for this, for the two over a rusticated basement. For that, you would probably have to look in Vincenzo Scamozzi's book. So, and even there's nothing exactly like the Banqueting House. So what Jones is doing was never imitative. He was drawing motifs and ideas from a range of Italian sources and combining them in new ways to suit English needs. And the next, please. And this is very apparent when you look at Jones's surviving buildings. His first building, the Queen's House at Greenwich, isn't really like anything built by the Palladio or Scamozzi, but it is in a general way Palladian in its approach to proportions and its use of the classical language. The Queen's Chapel on the right is probably inspired by images of ancient buildings, in particular temples, but it's a very pared down vision of an ancient temple and one without the peripheral columns and portico. So Jones is a Palladian in a loose sense, in that he's inspired by Palladio and he's using his books and drawings as source material, as ways of getting to the architectural language of the ancient world. And the next, please. Jones was a frantically busy man, the King's Surveyor of Works, constantly having to design entertainments and things for the court, redecorate things, maintain the royal palaces, and his buildings tend to be relatively small, the executed ones, except for his recasing of St. Paul's Cathedral. But his nephew and assistant, John Webb, seems to have had a sort of project to produce ideal or theoretical drawings of the kind that both Palladio and Scamozzi produced in large numbers, like the one you see on the left, which is a design for an ancient house. And it may be that Jones and Webb were planning some kind of architectural treatise of their own, because there are over 200 of these things, but we don't really know. At any rate, Webb as an architect has a markedly different character to Jones, and he produced a great many designs, like the one on the right, which is an unexecuted design for Somerset House, and they nearly are all unexecuted, for very large-scale palaces, which in their general design approach probably owe more to Scamozzi than Palladio, though you could say they are in a general way Palladian. And so there's this architectural enterprise at the heart of the English royal court, these two men who understood the principles of classical design, and the next slide please, better than anyone else in England, but with as yet very few opportunities to put it into practice. So Palladian principles were spreading rather slowly in England, initially through Jones and through Webb. And the next please. And I would argue that Webb is much the more Palladian of the two. His executed buildings have a much more clearly Palladian quality than Jones's designs and executed buildings, as I think you see by comparing the gallery, sadly long destroyed, that he designed at Somerset House, and I'm comparing it here in a general kind of way with the Palladio design for the courtyard of the Palazzo Tiene. And the next slide, please. And this is particularly apparent when you look at two remarkable villas which Webb designed, Gunnersbury House in Middlesex about 1658 and Amesbury Abbey in Wiltshire in 1660, so just on the cusp of restoration, and where other people in England were building double pile houses like like the Dutch House at Kew, like Tittenhanger, like Coleshill. Webb is here offering a completely different kind of plan, complex tripartite plans of the kind used by both Palladio and Scamozzi in their villas in the Veneto. And Webb would have seen designs for these in the Quattro Libri and also in the collection of drawings which he'd inherited from Jones. And there's the Palladian, intensely Palladian feature of the use of porticos on them, and the Palladian feature of a great central salone. And these were by far the most expressly Palladian buildings that had yet been seen in England. Rather sadly, one's been demolished and the other transformed beyond recognition. So Webb, as much as Jones, represents a fairly literal application of Palladian principles, but he was still a great rarity in the 1660s. And the next, please. But nevertheless, there is a sense that Palladian ideas and principles of design were beginning to percolate through late 17th century England. And this is something which long predates Lord Burlington, and there are a few other cases. So we might look, for instance, at this fine house in Lincoln's Inn Fields, possibly designed, possibly built by Nicholas Stone, the great mason contractor who actually built the banqueting house for Jones and knew him very well. Jones may have been involved, but he was really probably too busy to provide a detailed design for, for a commercial development in Lincoln's Inn Fields. So I think we can say that his influence is there, and that was, whoever built that, it was someone who knew Jones and approached Palladio through him. And on the right, we have Peckwater Quadrangle, built startlingly early in its way, 1707, and designed by the Dean of Christ Church himself, rather good amateur architect. And if you look at those designs, you could say that, well, yes, these are both like simplified reinterpretations of the Palazzo Isepo da Porto, which of course was illustrated in the 4 books, and they have a character which we call Palladian. And the next, please. And indeed, Palladio had got translated into English for the first time. Just the first book, the one with the orders, published by Godfrey Richards in 1663, and that would certainly have helped the spread of his influence in late 17th century England. And it is possible to see elements of Palladio and motifs of Palladio in buildings by Sir Christopher Wren and Nicholas Hawksmoor and John Vanbrugh. And the Quattro Libri is the only architectural book we know Vanbrugh to have owned. And the next, please. And there was another curious connection through a remarkable Scottish architect called James Smith, who was a Catholic and went to train for the church as a seminarian in Italy in the 1670s, and he saw Palladian buildings, and there is a large collection of drawings by him which were found and published by Howard Colvin, which include such expressly Palladian designs as these. And the next slide, please. But although, oddly enough, Smith didn't use this design approach in his own executed work, which is far more in the French and Dutch-inspired late 17th century manner, but it may well have been him who passed on knowledge of Palladio and of his principal designs to a young lawyer turned architect who was called Colin Campbell, because otherwise it's quite difficult to account for Campbell designing this house, Shorefield Mansion, outside Glasgow, for a Glasgow merchant and slave trader in 1712. And Campbell really becomes the next major figure in the dissemination of Palladian principles of design in the British Isles, because he comes from Scotland, where he built this one rather distinctly Palladian looking house, to London. And in London, he took over the project to publish a collection of fine new classical buildings called Vitruvius Britannicus. And next slide, please. And he made it something of a vehicle for himself. Campbell was not, it has to be said, a very original designer, but I think he understood the appeal of Palladio's clear, simple, rational architecture, and how that might be appealing to the Protestant sensibilities of the English and Scottish elites. And so here he is simplifying and reimagining the Palazzo Isepo da Porto in an unexecuted design for Lord Isla. And the next slide, please. And Campbell, having first built what I think we have to call a Palladian villa at Shorefield outside Glasgow, then developed this design model for several other clients. And this is probably his greatest contribution to the development of English architecture, of classical architecture in England, was the adaptation of the villa form with its tripartite plan organization and its use of temple front porticos, whether as a frontispiece here, as a full portico, to English needs. And this is one of the first ones he designed, a house called Newby Park in Yorkshire. And the next, please. And the most elaborate of these, of course, is a sort of transposition of Palladio's celebrated Villa Rotonda, the Villa Capra just outside Vicenza, with its 4 porticos, not in this case a working farm, but a sort of belvedere for a very wealthy nobleman. And Palladio and Campbell produced a sort of transposition of it, a fairly close, almost copy, for the Earl of Westmoreland, a very wealthy English peer, in Kent, Mereweth Castle. As in Vicenza, so in Kent, the plan is not in fact an especially practical one, and this is not the first Anglo-Palladian building, which is something of a triumph of architectural form and idealism over practicality. And Mereweth wasn't really a very practical shape, and wasn't really big enough to be an English country house, and eventually it had to have service wings built, which are detached, so as not to affect its pristine perfection for it to function properly. But no matter, it represents very clearly the power and the appeal of this ideal. And the next slide, please. And so we need to start to think just briefly about what the appeal of this was. Because classical architecture in England had come from a great variety of sources, but in the late 17th century, the cultural influence of France had really been overwhelming and inescapable, and there's more French influence on the architecture of, say, Tolman and Wren and Vanbrugh probably than there's from anywhere else. But in the early 18th century, there are the signs of a shift in taste away from Baroque architecture of the kind offered in rather individualistic ways by Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor and Wren, to something that was purer and more rational and more evidently based on consistent rules. And in 1715, an Italian architect called Giacomo Leone and a French-born surveyor called Nicolas Dubois published a new English edition of Palladio with re-engraved plates. There was a strong sense that taste and interests were pulling in the same direction, with the publication of volume 1 of the Vitruvius Britannicus and of this superb new edition of Palladio. It's a very expensive book, much more expensive than Richards's, and thus clearly directed at clients in the same year, just at the time that Campbell was designing his first villa-type houses in England, and Campbell was also designing a huge Palladio-inspired great house called Wanstead in Essex. So there is a strong sense that a kind of austere, purified Roman classicism is appearing as a new fashion, as a leading fashion. But it's not entirely a new fashion, because as we've seen, it actually already had quite deep roots in English culture in the works of Jones and Webb and Roger Pratt and others, and people like Dean Aldrich. So it was a tradition which was already embedded in English culture, but with a sense in around 1715 its time had come. And the next, please. And this is very strongly manifested, of course, in the life and career of Lord Burlington, to the extent that Lord Burlington is sometimes thought of as the prime mover in the development of Palladian architecture in England. But as I think we've seen, that's really not true. Palladian influence was growing and spreading in this country, really from the moment that Indigo Jones started to work as a surveyor and architect around 1615. But it took almost exactly 100 years for it to become what you might call a leading strain, and then in the 1730s, the dominant strain in English architecture. And Lord Burlington is perhaps the most important figure in that transition from it being a popular new fashion around 1715 to being the dominant strain in English architecture. And the next, please. Lord Burlington is really a very remarkable man, and one who it's difficult to find a parallel for, a wealthy aristocrat who had travelled on the continent in 1715, shown no particular interest in architecture, and did so again in 1718. And he commissioned Campbell to refront his house, Burlington House, with another variant on the Palazzo Isepo Porto. And the next, please. And while in Italy for the second time, Burlington managed to acquire a large collection of drawings by Palladio, which had never been seen before. Palladio had meant to publish them, but hadn't, and they were his reconstructions of ancient baths. So it's a totally different type of drawing to what you get in the Quattro Libri. There are these vast buildings, which actually really did exist, but had generally disappeared. And they represent a gallery of ideal architectural forms for potential use in public buildings, but also in domestic buildings that rejected contemporary Baroque design, both British or French or Italian, and which flattered the British elite's rising self-image as the new Roman. And the next, please. And on returning home, Lord Burlington managed to cap this by buying a large collection of drawings by Palladio and Jones and Webb from John Tolman, and this gave him things like Jones's design for the Beaufort House Gate on the left, and one of Palladio's designs for Villa Valmarano on the right. And again, these things had never been published, only he had access to this, and Burlington thus, with what between this and his copies of books, in particular the Quattro Libri, had access to the whole design language of ancient Rome through paper sources. And the next, please. And it is arguable that this is above all what he was about. On occasion, this did mean literal imitation, as in Burlington's use of this unexecuted design, which he owned, which no one else really had seen. So Burlington used it as the garden facade for the house he designed for General Wade on Old Burlington Street around 1723. And the next, please. And this is a rather case in point of the power of an idea, for there is the same design reproduced later, quite a lot later, at the Provost's house in Trinity College, Dublin, and there is the same design again, painted by Zuccarelli for an Englishman living in Italy. And so the idea is produced initially, I think, by Bramante, then redesigned by Palladio, then the design goes to England, where Lord Burlington executes it for the first time, and then it's reimagined in Dublin, and it's painted by an Italian artist for a British client for his house in Italy. So it rather nicely shows the way in which idealized classical designs were becoming a language that was understood across much of Europe. And the next slide, please. Lord Burlington was asked to design an assembly room in York for by the good burghers of that city in 1731. And rather than starting with an analysis of what an assembly room actually needs to be, he saw it as an opportunity to realize an ancient design, in this case, Palladio's design for an Egyptian hall. Rudolf Wittcover pointed out this was the most austerely Roman building anywhere in Europe at the time, because what Burlington was seeking to do here was not really to create Palladian buildings, but to create Roman buildings, I think, using Palladio as his mentor, guide, and source. And the next slide, please. And we also see this when we come to his house, this very famous building, which is often taken to be a Palladian villa because it has the sort of shape of a Palladian villa. Actually, it uses villa forms by Scamozzi as much as by Palladio, and scholars like Richard Hewlings have analysed the source of Chiswick and found actually that the sources are from lots of places. But certainly there are things which Burlington has got through Palladio. The portico, as far as I can tell, and I leafed through my copy of the 4 books again this morning, seems to be from Palladio's view of the Temple of Catherine Pollux in Naples, and those wonderful room shapes are derived from the Roman bath designs, but in a way which Palladio himself never did, interpreted at miniature scale. And next, please. And by 1730, Lord Burlington was the leading arbiter of architectural taste. This kind of purified Roman classical architecture, which he was promoting, with Palladio as his source and Indigo Jones as a sort of great British forerunner, was spreading as a fashion amongst the Whig elite. Burlington and his most gifted associate, the architect and designer William Kent, dreamed of rebuilding the Palace of Westminster in designs that are derived from Palladio's Roman bath drawings. And there are a great many of these, and they're very remarkable exercises. And the next, please. And we would think about Georgian architecture very differently, I think, had they been built, but they weren't in the circumstances of the early Georgian politics. They were never likely to be. And so what we got was very much more modest public buildings instead, like Kent's Treasury buildings on Horse Guards. And as you see, even that is a reduced version from what he envisaged. And the next, please. Now, the culminating monument of this phase, what we may call the Burlingtonian phase of English classical architecture, without doubt, in the absence of a great new Palace of Westminster, is Holcomb Hall in Norfolk, a very remarkable house indeed, really, whose plan was Palladio's unexecuted design for the Villa Mocenigo with its 4 wings. But as you see, even so, the plan is not actually that much like the Villa Mocenigo, which is designed for a building with a hollow central courtyard. And the next, please. And I think that comparison's been overdone. And even when you look at a drawing like this is an executed design by Kent for Holcomb, and you can see, yes, that facade treatment does seem to owe quite a lot to Palladio's Palazzo Tiene, though actually it wasn't used. And the next, please. Holcomb was indeed a rather complex collaboration between Lord Burlington and Viscount Cook, later the Earl of Leicester, an unusually involved and interested client who'd spent 5 years in Italy and formed a great collection there, but with William Kent as the chief executive architect. And although this is often called Palladian, I think the use of the word slightly obscures the fact that it's not really like anything else in European architecture at the time, and nor is the rest of Burlington's work, and it's not really like other buildings which we call Palladian. It seems to me to be an evocation of Roman architecture, but in really a highly original way. And so I think that these buildings, Burlingtonian buildings, Burlington and Kent's buildings, are really something on their own, though Palladio is undoubtedly highly important to them. I think and the label does have a great deal of traction. And the next slide, please. So here's the hall at Holcomb, not really like anything in Palladio, but probably inspired by Palladio's plates of ancient temples, but there is no one Palladio image which you could point to and say, yes, this is the model of the hall at Holcomb. This work is much more original than that. And the next, please. And the next, please, Wayne. So why do we talk about Palladian architecture? Well, partly it's a matter of us needing labels, and this one is hallowed by long usage. And partly I think it reflects the fact that Palladio, through Burlington's ownership of his wonderful drawings, through his book, through the clarity with which Palladio presented his design principles, that was more influential than any other single Italian source. And I think there is a really valid point there. And there's another point, which is that interest counted for an enormous amount in Georgian culture. And once Lord Burlington's bandwagon as architectural taste was really rolling, he managed to get his nominees into the Office of Works, and they got their nominees in turn. And this list, which we can't really discuss in any detail, shows how far designers, carpenters and masons who became architects, designed buildings in a Palladian mode and almost monopolized the official post in the Office of Works in the 1720s through to the 1760s and even beyond. And next, please. And by the 1720s, this kind of purified, refined Roman-inspired architecture, with Palladio's Quattro Libri as an important source, was rising all over England. And we'll finish with a few examples. Here is Marble Hill by a particularly talented architect called Roger Morris. And the next, please. And this is Kelmarsh Hall in Northamptonshire by James Gibbs and Kirtlington Park in Oxfordshire. And what I think you see fairly quickly is that these are nothing like as complex and sophisticated as something like Chiswick and Holcomb, which are really highly complex, unique cerebral creations and actually not that readily reproducible. Because they're all unique works of art based in ancient sources. And what we normally are talking about when we talk of Palladian architecture is something which has come from Palladio and Scamozzi with a degree of inspiration from Jones and Webb, and with quite a large dash of Campbell and his approach to interpreting Palladio in there. And they're a lot simpler and more formulaic than Burlington and Kent's sophisticated designs. And the next, please. And across England, craftsmen and architects equipped with the Quattro Libri started to produce urban architecture like this, like Queen Square in Bath on the left and the Town Hall in Blandford Forum on the right. And I think there is some sense in calling this Palladian because it represents something real, you recognize it when you see it, and although its roots in Palladio can be questioned and taken apart, I think there's little doubt that Palladio himself represented an ideal which was being aspired to, and which also in a practical way, through Palladio's books, was providing a lot of the means to design this kind of thing. And the last slide, I think, please. So here we are, two English country houses, a recognisably British kind of classical architecture, which we term Palladian. And the label can certainly be criticised, but I do think it denotes something real. Well, on the one hand, these buildings are intensely English. And if you look at the plan, if you look at the size of the windows, at the glazing style, at the way they're built, at their internal disposition, they're very specifically English or British, and they couldn't possibly be in Italy. But nevertheless, if Palladio had not lived and had not written his four books, these houses would probably not look quite like this. And I think that Palladio probably is the most influential individual, deep in the background though he may be, when thinking about buildings like this, and that his influence is something real. His expression of an ideal classical architecture was so powerful, so coherent, so adaptable and so universal in its potential that it's as relevant and applicable in Worcestershire on the left and Lancashire on the right as it was in the Veneto or in Ireland or in Russia or in the great state of Virginia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for that wonderful overview and introducing so many interesting points and observations, and coming at it from my perspective, which is a study of Indigo Jones and also John Webb. I was very struck by your comment that Webb was more Palladian than Jones. Of course, as you mentioned, Webb copied Palladio's drawings and adapted the designs, where it's interesting that Jones, although he had this large collection, in his annotations in his Quattro Libri, scarcely refers to the drawings at all. What is interesting about Webb is, of course, that his hand was mistaken for Inigo Jones's. So when Lord Burlington published or arranged for the publication of his collection of Jones drawings, and William Kent put these designs out in print in 1727, that book, The Designs of Inigo Jones, contained many, many designs by John Webb, which were then accepted as Jones's. But one point I want to get onto is the Palladian interior, how the distinctive domestic, small-scale domestic Palladian interior came about. And I think here Webb is interesting because Webb was the surveyor at Wilton House. He worked under Jones in the design of new interiors in the south range of Wilton House, together with a very gifted painter, Edward Pearce Sr. And this team of three effectively created, in my view, the first Palladian interiors, which involved bringing external architecture into the house with pedimented door frames held on columns, with dado rails and wall panel divisions, so that the external architecture is brought inwards in a very colourful way. And this basically formed a pattern for internal architecture in the Palladian revival, as we saw in your section through Merriworth House, building of the early 1720s. But at that, it then became something very monochrome because designers were relying on engravings and prints, and we have this white type of interior with very little color. And then there was a reaction against that under Robert Adam, who criticized the whiteness and the harshness of domestic interiors. So in a way, the whole process of creating a classical interior comes full circle with Robert Adam. But can you comment a little on the creation of the Palladian interior, the distinctive Palladian domestic interior in the 1720s, 1730s, and 1740s?
Oh, Gordon, that is such an interesting point, isn't it? It shows how British designers were really using ancient motifs and Italian motifs, now I think a good many from French sources too, to make something which was really quite new. There's nothing like that in Palladio's own work, which is a point you've made to me. Of course, in Italy, there were very clearly set out rules for designing, portioning the interior of a church, using Latin language in a very rigorous way, but not so much for designing interiors. And so when you're faced with this problem, they were really sort of starting not from scratch, but having to think about how to do it. I love the idea that they were sort of inventing this approach design maybe at Wilton. I think we're slightly hampered here by the loss of so much of Jones's earlier work from the court, and we can't see what he'd done previously. And it is possible that if we could see all of Whitehall Palace, that we'd see some of these ideas being tried out there. But I think that is a brilliant point. Well, and I think the other key figure here is Kent, and the years that Kent spent in Italy. And I think Kent had learnt a lot about Italian design language, and I don't think this is certainly not something completely invented in England. I think there are French motifs arriving in the works of designers like Daniel Morrow, and then Kent produces heads a reaction against French influence using Italian design approaches, but also using a lot of motifs which are really by Webb, as you say. Yes. And his work is incredibly interesting, very powerful synthesis to make a new architectural way of conceiving interiors, which I think really is something specifically Georgian, but with these very interesting complex sources. Yes.
In fact, we have to face the fact that Palladio, for all the comprehensiveness of the Quattro Libri, falls short on information about how to design an interior. He provides designs for doors and windows, and in fact, Godfrey Richards, in his edition of Palladio in 1663, highlights doors and windows as a subject, which is a subject of a chapter or two in book 1. But it's interesting that actually the shortest chapter in the entire Quattro Libri deals with vaults and ceilings, just about 9 lines long, with a group of illustrations that Inigo Jones couldn't understand. And he had to ask Scamozzi to explain Palladio's system of vaulting. So the Quattro Libri posed Jones serious problems when it came to designing interiors. And I think it's addressing that successive generations of architects in Britain had to cope with, and eventually came up with, as you say, a very interesting amalgam of motifs, the finest examples of which are probably in the interiors at Chiswick.
Gordon, those are incredibly interesting points, Gordon. When you think how different the circumstances were, if you go into a Palladio house in the Veneto, it's a house in a very hot country with very bright sunlight, with relatively small ratio of window to wall, and these great high interiors, which are designed to keep the interiors cool and free from glare. And of course, that doesn't really work in England at all, where we have this sort of damp, misty, cooler climate and soft sunlight diffused through clouds. And there's Palladio telling you telling you how to put in your rooms and make them really immensely high by most historic English standards. And Jones and Kent really have to work with that sort of rules and make them work in England. So the windows have to get bigger, there have to be altogether more fireplaces, they have to have linings to insulate things and keep things warmer, they need to let more light in all sorts of ways. What Kent is doing is actually subtly adjusting the rules to suit for English needs. I don't think he's given nearly enough credit for how brilliantly he did this, actually.
Yeah. just, I know we're running out of time, but just one other point around the house house designed in the tradition of Palladio, that is the garden setting. There's been very interesting work on the design of garden settings in the 17th century, how architects emulated in some sense the wall courtyards of some of Palladio's villa designs. Certainly John Webb copies designs for that purpose. But in the 18th century, how can you relate a building like Chiswick and its setting with a villa by Palladio? What are the points in common with regard to the garden setting of Chiswick Villa?
Well, Palladio doesn't really illustrate his garden designs in the Quattro Libri, does he? So unless you'd been there, you wouldn't really know how they sat in their setting. And you wouldn't necessarily know that most of them are surrounded by farmyards and courts and don't actually have elaborate designed garden settings at all. The Villa Barbaro has that wonderful garden court in Nymphaeum at the back, but you really have to have been there to know about that. What they didn't have, as far as to the best of my knowledge, any of them, was really highly wrought gardens like the ones you would find in villas around Rome, like the Villa Lante or at Caprarola, and of the Villa d'Este, built by the great Roman aristocracy. And I think there are other sources, aren't there, like Robert Castell's books, Villas and Gardens of the Ancients. And I think people like Kent, who'd spent a long time in Rome and knew about Roman garden design and the way in which a garden of something like the Villa d'Este evoked the ancient world in this sort of highly loose and elusive, rather than archaeological way, is actually from different strands in Italian culture. I think Lord Burlington and Kent were able to conceive the garden at Chiswick because they knew about landscape paintings by Claude, but more particularly they'd been to Rome and Tivoli and they'd seen Italian gardens there, they knew about Giardini Secreti. And I don't really think that strand comes very much from Palladio, does it? To be honest, it's not something I've thought about very much.
Yeah. Just maybe one concluding point, a more general one. This is about the portico itself. As you know, the late Giles Worsley, a wonderful historian, in his book, Indigo Jones and the Classicist Tradition, argues that the portico was a symbol of sovereignty and that its use carried a particular weight in terms of the symbolism associated with it. Can you relate the use of the portico in 18th century Palladian architecture in any sense to a broader cultural and social aspiration?
It's long been a puzzle to me, actually, Gordon. I'm pretty clear, I think it's pretty clear, that porticos were not used on domestic buildings in the ancient world because, and frankly, to do so would probably have been regarded as sacrilegious. A portico meant this was the house of the gods. And what's interesting is that so many people from Palladio to, I think, Lord Burlington, seem to have been quite clear that they were used in domestic context, or at any rate was a perfectly appropriate thing to do. Jones did not, I think, except in that design for the Prince's Lodging at Newmarket. I don't think we know if it was executed or not. Webb did, of course. What did they think they were representing? I think there was a passage in the Quattro Libri where Palladio actually says a portico is a fitting sign of the residence of a great man, or words to that effect. I think Giles is pushing the idea a lot further than it'll go. And what do you mean by sovereignty, Giles? I would want to ask him if he was with us. Is it the sovereignty of a lord over his estate? I think the analogy is getting rather loose here. This is something which puzzles me a little, I would have to say, but that Palladio is the originator of the reuse of temple fronts on residences does seem to be true. Quite what he meant by using them and what the Georgians meant by using them, I'm not quite sure. But I think if you thought about this very long at all, you would realize that in the ancient world, they didn't do it, and in the ancient world, it would have been regarded as sacrilege. So I have to admit I'm puzzled by the whole thing.
Yes, okay. Well, there have been quite a few little questions in chat, which I've just noticed. I feel I ought to address one of them.
Oh my God.
The question from an RM is, did Palladio produce any theatre designs? Well, yes, there was a large collection of record drawings of ancient Roman theatres. And of course, Palladio designed the Teatro Olimpico. And these were drawings that John Webb also copied and adapted. So this collection of drawings of Roman theatres actually fed its way into the design of the English stage, partly through the work of John Webb. So we're getting a lot of interesting comments, and it's probably time to draw things to a conclusion. I just want to thank you very much, Stephen, for such a rich presentation, taking us across a broad sweep of architectural history and showing the profound influence of Palladio on English architecture in so many different ways, and focusing particularly on the 18th century, where this tradition culminates. So my sincere thanks to you, Stephen, very much indeed. And I'm sure all of us present are most grateful to you for sharing your wisdom with us.
Gordon, thank you very much. And thank you very much to the British Architectural Library Trust for hosting this terrific series. And I'm really getting a lot out of it too. Gordon and Ted, thank you both very much indeed. Thank you, Wayne.
I'd like to add my thanks to both Stephen Brindle and Gordon Higgott for a